All right. Kia ora koutou, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome. My name is Dane Gunnell, and I'm the Head of Price Quality Regulation here at the Commission. I'll kick us off with a karakia and a short introduction before handing over to the team for discussions proper. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia makinakina ki uta. Kia mataratara ki tai. Ehi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhonga. Haumie, huie, take. Tihe, Māori ora. First off, thank you very much for coming today. It's great to see a good turnout across the workshops that we've held in the electricity space this month and others we've attended across the industry. There's a heck of a lot going on as we tackle the challenge of decarbonisation, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But we really see the value in these two-way conversations with FaceTime to help progress our thinking. The topic for today is reopeners, or reconsideration of the price quality paths, recognising that whilst they haven't been used in anger to date as part of the regime, we see them as a really important option to help address some of the uncertainty and the pace and scale of change as New Zealand increasingly electrifies the economy. We recognise that for reopeners to work, they need to be as efficient as possible, and for businesses to have clarity about what scenarios they apply to and what supporting information is required. The workshop today is formally part of the IREN review and picks up on an introductory conversation that we had on reopeners as part of the EDB forecasting workshop earlier this month. And the focus is really to drill down more into those issues that have been raised to date in submissions, and we thank you for those, to hear from you and to test some of our thinking on potential solutions as we work towards draft decisions on the IREN review mid-next year and final decisions towards the end of next year. I think there is a wider context for the workshop and reopener discussion that is worth briefly touching on. And that is really that reopeners aren't the only tool that we have in the shed, and we should be mindful that the initial DPP revenue setting, recoverable costs and CPPs, other flexibility mechanisms will better suit some scenarios. And with that in mind, we've kicked off the DPP process early so it can be part of the same conversation. And we're conscious that we need to progress some of this work and thinking alongside the IREN review. Just briefly, CPPs and other flexibility mechanisms like recoverable costs are within scope of the IREN review, but they aren't the main topic for discussion today. So obviously we can discuss these for reference, but in terms of drilling into the detail, we'll save that for reopeners. And I think we also should be mindful that whilst reopeners will serve an important purpose going forward, they aren't a silver bullet for dealing with uncertainty and could become burdensome for industry and for the Commission if the right balance isn't struck. And that wrong balance could also undermine incentives for efficiency and forecasting. Lastly, just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to the team. Please introduce yourselves when you speak and state the organisation that you're representing. We really do want to hear from you today, so please do speak up, but put your questions through the chat or use the raise hand function in Teams, and we'll endeavour to get across everybody. There will be the opportunity for written comments following the workshop, so please do get those in, and the workshop is being recorded and we'll publish that, so that's available for reference. Please use the framework, the IREN review framework in making your submissions. So we published a paper on that earlier this year after some consultation, and Grant Weston, one of our chief advisors, will touch on that in a bit more detail, but that's really helpful for us in terms of having your views expressed in the context of the framework that we'll use to make our decisions on the IREN review. And finally, just a quick note that any views expressed today are staff views for the purpose of discussion and don't represent the formal views of commissioners as decision makers. Thank you. Over to you, Grant.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Grant Weston. I'm a Chief Advisor at the Commerce Commission. One of the things that I'm currently working on is the input methodologies review, and the main work stream that I'm working in is the reopeners work stream, the CPP and reopeners work stream. I'd like to make some brief introductory comments before we dive into the topics of this session. In the slide pack that we sent out, we included some terminology that we will use in today's discussion. The terms we'll use, like reopener, aren't typically used in the IMs themselves, but they may soon be. That's something we're considering. However, we will use them today because this is what we use on a day-to-day basis. If at any stage one of us uses a term that you're not familiar with, please put that into the chat and we'll attempt to explain it to you. This slide and the next slide are the core framework for our decision making for the IM review. When making comments or submissions to us in our current consultations, it is useful if you can reference these if possible. Specifically for any decisions to change the reopeners, we will be applying the framework. We'll be asking ourselves and we'll be inviting you to consider whether any changes to the IMs that are proposed better promote the Part 4 and IM objectives. If your comments or submissions fall outside of the scope of this framework, we might need to address them outside of the IM review, for example, under a price quality path reset or under information disclosure. We'll let you know if we need to do this. I'll now hand over to Sapna Nair to talk about how we deal with the various trade-offs in our decision making.
Thanks, Grant. Kia ora koutou. I'm Sapna and I'm a Chief Advisor at the Commission and the Technical Lead for this workstream. In thinking about reopeners and considering expanding the scope of these, there are a few points that we have to balance and be mindful of. The first is remembering the purpose of a DPP as a relatively low-cost generic approach. And in introducing new or expanded reopeners, this will likely add to the complexity and cost of the regime. 2, the increasing use of reopeners as a tool might not actually result in certainty for businesses, as the application could be declined, or if approved, the amount approved could be less than what was applied for. And 3, there is also the potential that having reopeners might remove incentives for businesses to innovate and be efficient. In our review of reopeners, we're thinking about the principle of proportionate scrutiny, which means considering where our effort goes instead of a one-size-fits-all approach. Ideally, applications for reopeners with the greatest potential impact on price or quality should attract greater scrutiny. You'll see elements of this in our current thinking on the reopener process, which Grant and James will take you through later. Before we get into the specific topics and issues, we thought it would be useful to explain our general approach to reopeners. Reopeners are to be used selectively rather than routinely for significant material, generally externally driven situations. For events that are either unforeseeable at the time the price quality path is set, or foreseeable but uncertain in timing and cost. A supplier may initiate the process, or we can if a trigger event occurs. The approach of limiting the circumstances in which DPPs can be reconsidered is consistent with what the Act says about the purposes of DPP and CPP regulation. Reopeners are not used as a substitute for CPPs. So where there is a need for a higher level of scrutiny, a CPP may be a more appropriate tool. One of our priorities for today is to better understand what increased uncertainty might mean for the role of reopeners. When we talk about the current and future drivers of reopeners that businesses are faced with, we'd like to understand the nature of the scenario, particularly whether the scenario is foreseeable and the amount of control that suppliers have over the impact of these scenarios. I'll now hand you over to Samantha for a quick refresher of our existing reopeners.
Morena, everyone. My name is Samantha Kutasera, and I am an assistant analyst at the Commission, and Sapna and I will be covering this part of the presentation. You may remember this diagram from the workshop on 7 November. It is a visual of all of our current reopeners. We will be talking about these reopeners in terms of scenario coverage later on, so stay tuned. We've shown pass-through and recoverable costs in grey on the far left, which are largely mechanistic and require none or limited intervention by us. We won't be covering this today, but if you have any material thoughts on pass-throughs and recoverables, you're welcome to include these in your feedback post-workshop. Next, we have DPPs in blue, light blue, our generic approach to setting allowances with limited scrutiny. On the far left, we have CPPs, which are on the other end of the spectrum, so they require detailed scrutiny and is what we consider to be our largest reopener. The space between the DPP and the CPP are the reopeners along with their thresholds. In green are the reopeners where the expenditure is foreseeable at the time of the DPP reset, but the timing and magnitude of the cost is uncertain. Then in orange, where the expenditure is unforeseen. We thought it would be useful to quickly touch on the scenarios that are already covered by these reopeners. So firstly, adverse events are covered through the catastrophic event reopener. If there are new legislative or regulatory requirements or changes to these are covered by the change event reopener. The error event reopener covers a situation where incorrect data was used in setting the price quality path or incorrect application of data. Related to this is the false or misleading information reopener, which is provided for in the IAMs for a very unlikely situation. Then the major transaction reopener covers situations where networks are consolidated, split, or where assets used to serve consumers are otherwise transferred. Demand uncertainty is covered for electricity through the unforeseeable and foreseeable major CAPEX reopeners, addressing connections, system growth, and asset relocation, and for gas through the capacity event reopener. For gas, a risk event reopener exists that covers situations where unforeseen asset deterioration has a major impact on quality standards or safety. And I'll pass over to Sap now.
Hi. So we might have to come back to the slide for reference when we talk about scenario coverage and the type and extent of reopeners later. But I'll just pause here for a minute to see if you have any questions on this ecosystem slide.
Oh, hi, Seb. Andrew from PowerCo. Just been pondering, do you see a need for the $30 million cap at all for the foreseeable and unforeseeable project reopeners?
I think that the $30 million cap is there for a reason. Yeah, the reason it's there is beyond that point, beyond 30 million is the point at which a CPP might kick in. So our current thinking is, for that cap to remain, but I guess when we speak about thresholds later on, we can explore that a little bit further with businesses. So keen to hear your thoughts on that later on in the workshop.
Thanks.
Do we have another one? Hi, Len.
Oh, hi, Len Howes from Major Gas User Group. Just looking at your lower thresholds for unforeseeable expenditure, they seem quite low. Is there a risk of creating too much scope for reopeners in this?
That's a really good point. I think, yeah, the thresholds were there for a reason, and it is to discourage too many reopeners. Sorry, can you just repeat your question then?
Yeah, sorry, the lower thresholds, as I read it from the graph, basically it's saying that anything more than 1% of revenue impact would create a trigger for a reopener. And
Yeah.
that seems relatively low, given that, you know, even on some price pass stuff, plus or minus 5% or 10% is often accepted as a risk for regulated entities. So is the 1% lower threshold set too low with respect to if you're trying to avoid too many reopener requests?
So that's, yeah, I guess I'll be interested in your view as to what you think it should be.
I think to date, it's not something that we've seen parties avail themselves of throughout the regime, Lynn. So I guess to date, it's not been something that's been a particular concern, but obviously today that's hopefully what we want to dig into a bit more to understand where the risks might lie. And Andrew's obviously pointed out at the higher end, and we have to draw the boundary between a reopener and a CPP somewhere, but at that lower end as well, we definitely need to be mindful of the number and scale of what we might see coming through. And the point I made earlier about just the number of reopeners and whether or not that balance is struck appropriately between the initial revenue setting and what we see through reopeners. So absolutely interested to hear more on that.
We also had a question with the fan. And Brown, is the revenue cap 1% of 5-year DPP or 1 year revenue?
I'll take that one. Yeah, hi. And the question is whether the 1% is an annual or is an accumulated revenue amount. It is actually the accumulated for the remaining years of the period that are affected by the reopener. So if, for example, the reopener is to be applied, say, to the last 3 years of a DPP period, you would take into account the forecasted net allowable revenue for the remaining 3 years and apply the 1% to that. Hopefully that answers the question.
I can see that that Ken Brown's just put his hand up as well. So would you like to combine Ken?
Yeah, Ken, would you like to speak?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Ken.
All right. Yes. Sorry. That was the reason for my question. That somebody had suggested 1% was quite low. Horizon I work for Horizon Networks or Horizon Energy, and we're a comparatively small EDB with about a 30-odd million-ish revenue and amount. So 1% of that would be 300,000, but if it was a number of years, it would be a higher amount. So I would suggest that in actual fact, the 1% would be a useful and valid level to allow if we wanted to use a reopener.
We have been testing that on an international basis with comparable jurisdictions, with the AER in Australia and Ofgem in the UK, and they're finding the lower thresholds of around about 1% to 1.5% are workable and not causing them sort of undue stress in terms of their the way they run their reopeners. So at this point, we are still pretty comfortable at the 1% based on the remaining open years in the reg period. We will talk a little bit later on, though, about what happens below the level of that threshold, what we contemplate in terms of adjustments to the price quality path. If, for example, you have an event that doesn't meet the threshold, but that could justify perhaps some sort of mechanism for adjustment during a regulatory period. So hand back.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks. Hand back to Sapna.
Thanks for those questions. Just move to issues. So the tables on this slide and the next one are a summary of the key issues that we're working on based on what we heard in submissions. and our current direction of analysis on these issues. For the purposes of analysis, we've shown these as discrete, separate issues in the table, but in reality, these topics are actually very much interrelated. The major focus of our work to date has been on DPP reopeners. So that's looking at the process for the application and evaluation of reopeners to see if we can make it clearer. Looking at thresholds and whether there is new information that would cause us to reconsider these. The type and extent of reopeners and how these cover the scenarios that we heard about in subs. Considering whether there are other mechanisms that might have a role to play. Whether CPP requirements need to be more streamlined and whether there is a role for a single issue CPP that applies to only one part of a supplier's DPP. So for each key issue that I just went through, members of our team will be taking you through where our current thinking is at and some questions to further unpack what we heard in submissions that we then need to feed into our analysis. There are two issues that are in scope for our analysis that we won't be covering at this workshop today, which is the inclusion of OPEX in reopeners and making our reopener provisions clearer and more consistent between sectors. I'll say, though, that you will have the opportunity to comment on these two topics through the question set that we're going to be publishing after this workshop. And of course, again, after we publish our draft decisions next year. I will now hand you over to Grant and James, who will talk about the reopener process.
Thanks, Abner. In this section, James and I will discuss our current direction of thinking on the reopener process. Our proposed approach is based on the problem definition that was identified by stakeholders on our process and issues paper. We received a variety of submissions, including from the ENA and the number of the EDPs and from Chorus in this respect. And in particular, the suggestion was that we should streamline the requirements because the requirements are not easy to follow and not providing sufficient guidance. We can, at this point, I'd like to hand over to James. James will take you through the table of the reopener process that we've included in the slides.
Thanks very much, Grant. I'm James Aldridge. I'm an analyst at the Commission and I'm on this work stream. So the table over the next 3 slides sort of breaks down the stages of what happens if or when we reopen a price path. So what we're thinking is that the process will be based around the general idea of three stages. So there's the trigger stage, the reconsideration stage, and then the amendment stage. And we're proposing to structure it broadly in this sequence. So since we first published the first set of IMs in 2010, we've sort of refined our drafting technique. So the most recent example of that was for the fibre IMs, which we published in 2020, as Grant mentioned. So some of the refinements we were thinking of making is just around the process of reopening a price path. So things like when a PQ path may be reconsidered or amended. So moving that to the front rather than currently it sits at the back of this section in the Part 4 IMs. Things like the procedural requirements for a reconsideration process. And then things like the Commission consideration of whether to amend a PQ path. We put that in after, put that in as well. And so on column, the right-hand column of the slides here, some of the specific things we were thinking about adding. So things like the preliminary evaluation of whether a trigger event has occurred. So it's probably more of an informal step where a party might approach us to see whether it was worthwhile submitting an application. Things like the requirement to identify the main driver for the reopener application. Things like why the reopener is justified and whether there is justifiable urgency, so it can be prioritized. the use of application windows during a regulatory period. And then if we are satisfied that a reopener event has occurred, there's various things that we may have regard to, the various procedural requirements that we might have regard to. So things like any demonstration of or results of any consumer consultation that has been undertaken in respect to the proposed reopening, the extent to which the applicant demonstrates it is considered reprioritization of its DPP CPP expenditure allowance in response to the trigger event, or the extent to which there could be fast track amendments. So things like making it clear that each reopener event, what the PQ path amendments would be, and how they would be applied. So to CapEx, OpEx, etc. And the other thing we were thinking of is making it clear for each reopener event what the PQ path amendments would be, and if or how they might be applied. So that's going through the table there. If there were any questions on any of those, I'd be happy to field those. Otherwise, I might pass back to Grant.
So our approach then is to adapt the structure of the reopener process that was developed for the fibre IMs, and they can actually be found on our website in the same area as the main in the main input methodologies page on our website. Both the Part 4 IMs and the fibre IMs are on that main page. We're also thinking about, as James said, some additional steps that we think are relevant to Part 4 that are not included in the fibre IMs and that we'd like to engage with you on. Our current thinking on those possible steps is set out in those tables, and we'd invite your comments on those.
So just pointing it on, I see that we've got a question from Saba Malik. So yeah.
Yes, Saba, a question?
Saba from the Lions Company. My question was about the process and the minimum limit. What is Commission's thinking around, like, for smaller expenditures? Is it like necessary to go through all that process, or is there a possibility to have a straightforward process for like small reopeners, like, or small expenditures like 1% of revenue, where we are talking about 360,000 expenditure like CapEx investment, and looking at the number 360,000 in like all these process steps, it looks like too much overwhelming for a small EDB putting in this much effort for a small expense. Are there any other better options that Commission is thinking of for smaller expenditures, like 1% of revenue, like easier, straightforward, less resource intensive, or simple?
I mean, the approach that we're using in terms of designing the process is to have a standard process and set out some of these requirements, and then what we're looking at is whether there would be a provision that's similar to what's already in the CPP requirements, which is what we refer to as the modifications and exemptions provision, that allows a party to come in and say, these requirements don't apply to us for the type of reopener that we're seeking. Can we modify the process? So we start with a standard process, and then bring in the ability to apply for a modification to the process. The other thing is for smaller scale events where the impact is of smaller scale and is underneath the threshold amounts, then we're looking at other mechanisms, and we'll talk about that in a little while. I guess I'd like to turn to the formal questions then, and they kind of go along the same lines as your question. The ones that we've highlighted there, in the submissions, we received a request to provide guidance on the current rules, but when we went to look at the current rules, we found that they weren't really in a cohesive shape, and that we felt that the better answer was to update the rules and update the process as we're setting out today. So the question is, rather than provide the separate guidance on the current rules, would this updated process, do you think this updated process would address any concerns that you have on the current lack of clarity in the reopeners? And are we on the right track? Does anyone have any comments in terms of the approach, apart from that comment that we've had now, that maybe what we're suggesting is possibly too comprehensive? Andrew.
Thanks. The lens I suggest taking to this as well is to think if a customer is seeking certainty or clarity about how an EDB will process the implications of what it wants to do, how fast can that be done? I can talk through an example of that, which might be later, but I think there are a range of circumstances or events that will lead to a distributor essentially needing to bring forward expenditure it may have planned for or may not have planned for at all. So when I think of the likes of the large customers, lens an example, if a customer's wanting to do something on the network, how does this process enable that? And I think you're suggesting the modifications process might be a way to sort of fast track things if possible, but that's just one observation, is that some of these things are driven by I'll call it a customer event, or the implications of a customer event that are material.
There's a couple of different ways that we're approaching this. One is to set out the requirements, and in those requirements suggest that the areas that we would take into account in evaluating a reopening request. So the sorts of things that we're interested in is, for example, has the distributor consulted with consumers or otherwise considered the impact of the reopener on consumers? To what extent has the distributor considered the prioritisation of its expenditure before it's considered applying for example, additional expenditure or a change to quality standards or other adjustments under the reopener? So it's about setting out the sort of type and quality of information that we would be expecting to see, so that we can fast track the application. And the other thing that James mentioned was being a bit more prescriptive in terms of the adjustments that we're likely to make against each of the reopener events, so that the applicants can understand what the adjustments are likely to be before they make their application. Dane's got a comment as well on this.
Yeah, I think we get your point around time and the amount of time it'll take to process an application, Andrew, and that was kind of upfront the comments I made around making sure that we're efficient. And I guess we're mindful that in setting out a process that we'd follow, that's helpful for clarity, but if we overbuild it, that could potentially slow things down. And Grant's rightfully kind of raised that's where we see there is a role for potentially exemptions or modifications to that process. But even that, that's a process you've got to go through, which could potentially add extra time. But I think probably what's helpful for us to do is to set out some expectations around how long we think a process might take. And obviously it depends on the exact nature of the reopener and the information we provided for how fast we can move through that process. But in terms of expectations for everybody, I think, and a general expectation of how long a reopener process should take, or a range, is probably helpful and something we can do.
Thanks. I think the only data point I'd add to that is, and I think we submitted this data to you confidentially as part of the DPP3 decision to the Commission. One case that we have for a large organisation was essentially from confirming when they wanted their facility to go live to when our network needed to be ready to accommodate it was 2 years. So I think there may be, thinking about back to your original questions about the updating the process steps, that's possibly one thing that's different from fibre compared to electricity, is that you do get lumpy customer decision events, and we're going to see it through electrification as well. That will mean customers will potentially want to do something fast. They might have committed to ECA or government, yes, we'll have this done in 2 years' time. So as the onus is on us to help you and you to help us enable that in the time they're wanting, and for us essentially not, I don't want to say God charge them, but just make sure we can, everyone has everything lined up to happen, because it's the physical builds should ideally be the thing that is the constraint, as opposed to us putting rules in the way. Internally,
and that's an interesting scenario that you raise, and I guess that would test how we look at reopeners, but I think some of that will come down to the commitments that are made and how demonstrable they are, and what they exactly the form they take. But that's something we can work through. But thanks, Andrew. That's a useful scenario to raise.
So all I say is, for your thinking about your stages, is there a that trigger stage may include a sort of triage, high level filtering, discussion with the Commission. Thanks.
I see that we've had with them as the order in the order that I've seen them come in. So we'll go with Scott Scrimgeour first.
Hi, Scott from Wellington Electricity. So yeah, to endorse Andrew, I guess the devil's in the detail. I like the structure of having some sort of triage to maybe, move on different parts of speed. But I guess the real detail in the discussion, I think, will be what those triage points are, whether you need to consult, what do you do with network reinforcement that impacts general tariffs overall. So I guess it's just a comment around making sure we address those points there, the actual trigger events, because that's what's going to be meaningful. And in terms of guidance, I think that would be useful in terms of time it would take for customers, especially. Like, we're finding it really difficult at the moment to actually work what a reopener means in terms of a project plan. It does seem to be the critical path when you compare it to the build. And I guess hand in hand with that as well is how the Commission themselves resource for speeding these things through. Are those resources going to compete to other Commission programs at the same time? Just making sure we're not creating our own barriers.
We're really conscious of the business planning aspect from our end, and contemplating what that might look like, and in particular with the DPP coming up, what that would look like in DPP4 during that period. I guess typically we sense that reopeners might typically arise in years 2 or 3 of a DPP period. Prior to that, we wouldn't be expecting a lot of activity until around about the mid-period. And so really what we're talking about here is probably 2026, and so that gives us a little bit of time to think about our resourcing and how we build it into our standard business processes from our end. But we do have a view on what those overseas jurisdictions do in terms of that triaging process. And so we've got some lessons there that we can learn from them in terms of, for example, stratifying, you know, if we got a range of applications all at once, we could stratify them into relatively simple, standard, and complex. And when you get to the top end of complex applications, you might even be touching into a suggestion of a CPP, for example. But in the simple ones, where, for example, it might be a connection where there's a party that's paying a lot of the cost through capital contributions, we would think about the impact there and then what the negotiations had looked like between you and the other party, for example. So there's some flexibility and that initial process that James talked about, the kind of meet and greet aspect, the initial triage is going to be a fairly important aspect of this before we kick into the prescriptive processes.
And what certainty you can give customers as well. So keep in mind that they'll be planning their own, end dates as well. And if there's a whole bunch of certainty, will this be approved or will there won't be? It just creates little mini barriers through the process. But I like the triage. It sounds cool.
Yeah, I mean, to kick it off, we would have to come to agreement with the applicant on whether, in fact, a trigger event has actually happened or not. You know, do you even get through the first gate? You know, before you get started. We've got a couple of other questions. Len.
I think you're just referring back to your regulatory ecosystem slide, that graphic presentation. Just thinking about, I mean, various events could work in two directions, couldn't it? It's not always actively or adverse for suppliers. And in fact, it could actually be the other way around. So is this process actually open for consumers to trigger?
Well, at the moment, our rules don't provide for consumers to trigger it, but they do provide for us to trigger it if we thought that it was appropriate, and in most cases. So that's already in the existing rules. We haven't triggered it at this stage, but yes, it is theoretically symmetrical. It could go either way, yes.
Okay, so if that was the case, a consumer would need to maybe put up their hand to you guys to see whether you think it's worth a reopener.
Yeah, we're not contemplating opening it up specifically to consumer applications to us. But if they did approach us, then we would obviously have to think that through. Yeah.
Thank you.
Turn across to Alec.
Yeah, hi, Grant.
Hey, Alec.
Just with regard to the degree of prescription, I think there is a balance to be struck between too much and too little details in the rules. But I think from an EDB's perspective, EDBs need to be able to determine objectively that they are submitting a complete application that will be considered by the Commission. And so there needs to be, I think, a minimum degree of prescription within the rules to allow that to happen. And secondly, and it's aligned to the comments that Andrew made, is EDBs also need some certainty as to the time frame once submitted that they'll receive a decision. And that's particularly important when there is a third party involved with the EDB's project.
Yeah, appreciate that. And that's the approach that we're attempting to take. So we're interested in specific comments from you and others when we go out for submissions after this session on whether the topics that we're covering, particularly in those tables, are sufficiently scoped for those things that you're talking about. Hand over now to Jonathan for comment.
Oh, hi, Jonathan from Horizon Energy here. Just thinking about it from an EDB point of view, EDBs are sort of all facing same or similar risks which create these trigger events. So is there an opportunity to sort of streamline the process through sort of, precedent and case studies where you go, well, one EDB has already had this event, therefore we already know what kind of information is required, learn from others?
Yeah, we see this as a iterative process, a refinement process as we go along. The other thing that we're looking at is whether it's practical to essentially have multi-applicant sort of applications if a variety of parties are affected by the same event. Rather than a specific transactional event, whether there's a situation that arises at some point. I'm thinking outside of obvious things like catastrophic events or changes in legislation that typically affect pretty much everybody. Yeah. So yeah, there's some flexibility there in terms of how we will update the rules as we go along. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we've got Scott on.
Scott's been.
Oh, sorry. Richard, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, hi Grant. Richard Sharp from Vector. Just interested in sort of what consideration the Commission's made on how independent verification could play a part in the reopener process, and maybe shortening the Commission's process if an independent verifier type report could be submitted along with it, which sort of gives you a shortcut option if the supplier's happy to sort of look at taking that approach. I'm just interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, I think if we do this initial triaging process at the beginning and we conclude that the application is at that more complex end of things, then we would consider something like verification to try and streamline the process and in particular our evaluation stage. We are in the process at the moment, for example, of codifying the verification requirements for Transpower as part of the Transpower price path setting process. It's something that's been informally outside of the formal rules up to this point, but we are, I could say a bit of a fan of the verification process. It has worked very well for us in both for the Transpower IPP setting and for the CPPs. But it is, it takes some time and effort to put it together. So we would probably only use it at the more complex end of things. Sorry,
I could certainly see that if there was a number of applicants all hitting the Commission at the same time, that could create a resource issue for the Commission. So one way around that is to sort of maybe pass that off to some other party, which could then sort of provide some assurance that then shortens the Commission's process. So that was sort of my thinking there. But yeah, thanks for your answer, Grant.
Yeah. I think we're in a pretty good position to act in a fairly agile way if that situation arose, because we have a good idea of what the verification processes would look like in terms of the evaluation requirements and the contractual requirements and independence and all those kinds of things. So yeah, I think that'd be a great idea to include that. At this stage, we haven't included that in our model, but that is something that we would contemplate including as a possibility. Yeah.
Thanks.
with Alex looking later.
Yeah, Alec, you've got further comment?
Yeah, thanks, Grant. I would generally support Richard's comment around the use of verification. I think it is a very useful tool. I think though caution would need to be taken not just to replicate CPP requirements for reopeners. I think in particular the independence requirement for CPP verification can be quite challenging over time. That would be my main point.
Yeah, we're well aware of that and that the practicalities of that independence requirement. New Zealand's a fairly small market in terms of us being able to source independent advisors to act for us as verifiers. So yeah, that's something that we've sort of taken on board and we're still currently thinking about from a practicality point of view. I've got to say I'm pleased that someone who has experienced the verifier process thinks it's a great process. So thank you for that, Alec. I think at this stage we're at a point. I'll leave those questions now and invite you to think about those questions if you're going to be making submissions after this session. So I'd now like to invite you to take a break for about 10 minutes and restart our discussion at about 10:05. Thank you.
I think we'll make a start. Sorry.
I don't think.
Welcome back. We hope you found the opening session informative. I'm Susan Bowler and I'm a senior analyst in the team. Sam and I would now like to talk with you about the thresholds currently applied to reopeners.
Hello again, everyone. Previously, we shared this regulatory ecosystem, and in this diagram of the regulatory ecosystem, you will see that the thresholds are highlighted with the minimum on the left and the maximum on the right. You will notice that some of the reopeners have no maximum. The reopener thresholds ensure a supplier can seek reconsideration of a price quality path if the effect of an event is so material that the existing path is no longer appropriate. However, this needs to be balanced by restricting the circumstances or events under which a path should be reconsidered to maintain certainty. Our current view is that thresholds for reopeners work well because business size is accounted for through the use of scaled revenue percentages. And Susan?
A price quality path should only be reconsidered when the benefit is expected to outweigh the likely costs. A change event has to have a significant impact before the Commission will reconsider a price quality path. If the cost of an event is below the threshold level, the expectation is that the regulated provider will reprioritise funding it has received when the price quality path was set. As Grant has mentioned, reopeners typically happen 2 to 3 years after a reset. The Commission would need to consider whether the situation has changed so significantly that the evaluation that was done at the time of the reset is no longer relevant. We received a small number of submissions about the reopener thresholds, and several of you, Andrew, Len and Ken, talked about the reopener thresholds. So we would like to now open it up to hear your views on the size of our current thresholds.
So, Andrew first.
Oh, hi. I guess I was just envisaging a scenario where an unforeseen CapEx event driven by, say, customer activities is more than 30 million. Would we want the regulation, a number to get in the way of, applying the same reopener? Simple as that. So these things are constraints. So, constraints limit options. So there are probably other ways to, scrutinise or make things proportional if it's a more expensive or higher value reopener. But putting an arbitrary limit on it, I'm just not sure what the sort of alternatives are or rationale for sort of needing it.
I think our challenge is, it's just the scrutiny that is required above the 30 million mark. So, I mean, if you have any suggestions or views, we'd like to hear them either now or through the subs.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as, just what's the harm of having no limit, just like the other options, and then it just means the reopener is assessed on its merits, whether it's 29 million or 31 million. If we're not looking to index that for inflation and other things, there are a whole lot of things that can change cost drivers. So it just provides a bit of leeway for all parties, mainly the customer.
Right. Dane here, Andrew. I think you can definitely argue whether or not the current limit is appropriate, but I think it is helpful for the purposes of certainty to have a limit. I think that helps kind of draw the boundary in terms of our thinking of where a CPP might be more appropriate, because at some point it's probably a more fundamental look at your business if it's touching on quite severe levels of expenditure that's coming through. Interested in your views on whether we've got the current threshold right, but I think in general having a threshold is helpful.
Yeah, some other EDBs may have examples where bringing forward expenditure can be large. The risk of putting it to a CPP process, it sounds good in theory, but in practice, if consumers are, again, back to my example, wanting the network as part of a wider whole business system to deliver an outcome in a couple of years, that's not going to merge with a regulatory process that takes that long. So that's the challenge.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. That's helpful to know.
It's from Rob Tweedy.
Hey, Rob.
Hi. I think my only comment just with regards to the thresholds was, it's basically twofold. It was the 2 million cap. What we found is there've been some that just don't meet that threshold. So sort of 1.6 million up to 2 million, just below that 2 million. And you know, when we've got 3 or 4 of those sort of projects on the go, it actually does sort of add up. And I know Dane's already said that it is quite useful to have some sort of limits on those. One of the things that the team at Orion sort of mentioned was possibly to look at an aggregated approach. Now, I know this might be preempting a sort of one of the other slides further on in the discussion, where there's identified as demand growth or something along those lines, and I think that could be quite useful, a bit of an aggregated approach to the thresholds, where you say on your LV network you all of a sudden have a huge uptake of EVs, and that could potentially be driven by government incentives. It makes it really attractive, and all of a sudden you have this uptake. So it's things like that, and I think we've seen it with the Getty Fund, where all of a sudden you get this sort of interest in growth. So that was just a comment around the potential thresholds and potentially aggregating projects as opposed to having a specific CapEx project.
We are, our current thinking is that, I mean, we are considering cumulative application of the threshold. So there's a couple of things that we need to kind of cover, if we are to consider that, and that is that each project on its own should be substantive, and that the projects are all, the project that you choose to apply the cumulative threshold to need to be part of the same program or relate to the same scenario. Yeah, so there were a few submitters that mentioned this particular point, and it's something that we are thinking about.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
And we've also just had a question, so we'll come back to you in a second, Alec. We've just had a question coming on the chat from Will Taylor, who would like to know, does the answer to this question depend on what other mechanism exists for dealing with uncertainty, i.e. the Commerce Commission has mentioned introducing wash-ups and other mechanisms are on the agenda. So what residual problem are reopenings addressing?
Is Will on the call?
Yes, I am. Sorry. I guess my point was just that to me, it makes sense to think about the materiality thresholds holistically with everything else we're doing under the DPP to deal with uncertainty. So if it's just for the big problems and the big mistakes that we find out ex post, then maybe it makes sense to have a big threshold if we have other things that mop up the smaller issues. So that's all I'm saying, is to just think about the thresholds holistically.
Yeah, that's certainly part of our thinking, and we will talk a little bit about other mechanisms later in the workshop. We've got a separate session for that as well. Thanks for your feedback, Will.
Alec, I see you've lowered your hand. Did you still have a question that you would like to ask?
Oh, look, my comment was going to be very much along the lines of the comment that Rob made, and in particular, I think addressing the issue that where a project is below the threshold, EDBs are expected to reprioritise. And I think reprioritisation has a role to play in all of this, but we get multiple below threshold events that reprioritisation can become quite significant, and you start to eat into things like renewal expenditure, which has I guess a poor impact on reliability and safety issues for consumers.
I think that the thinking that Grant and James are doing on the process side of things also looks at the point that you just raised, Alec. Yeah, so I think when we receive an application, we'll be looking at information from you as to how reprioritization has happened. So that would be, I think, Grant, one of the forms of points of evidence that we might be looking looking at when a reopener application comes through. But we will make that clear. Any more questions at this point?
And just on the cumulative projects that Sapna mentioned and also Rob and Alec raised, we'd just be interested if any of you, and some of you already mentioned this, whether ever any of you have examples of where you would have applied for a reopener if projects could have been considered together, or if there's some future situations where you see a number of projects could be combined, which would meet the current threshold. So just wondered if there was anyone else, or whether you, Alec, or Robert would like to add to any of your comments.
Look, I guess from Aurora's perspective, we're in a slightly different situation with our CPP, and we have a customised reopener mechanism, if you like, through modifications and exemptions, which are, you know, a capacity event reopener and a risk event reopener. I haven't specifically looked to see how they align to the gas DPP, but they do permit some aggregation of projects. So I think, you know, we're in the process of considering a reopener on that basis at the moment. But you know, the devil's in the detail, and we've been engaging separately around those issues. But yeah, I would tend to support aggregation.
Scott.
Yep, so Scott here. I'm sorry, just driving badly. So we've had a couple of examples. One is the speed and how long it might take to get an application. We need urgent relocation works with just combining it with water works. And the other one, probably more importantly, is when we've got incremental growth from a whole bunch of different customers, or even 2 or 3 big customers on a network reinforcement piece of work, where this probably doesn't fit quite as well as it could.
Back to this example. Yeah.
If we were looking at cumulative projects, we'd need to consider how the evidence could be reviewed, and we'd also have to look at the application and evaluation criteria, and they'd probably need to be amended if the decision was made to look at cumulative consideration of projects. But thanks for the examples that you mentioned, and we've identified that could be something that you'd look at.
So part of our modelling for the climate change growth going forward is, with EV growth especially, and the potential conversion from gas, is growth from existing connections is likely to be a much bigger driver than new connections. And I guess the uncertainty around the speed of that demand increase is probably where we're scratching our heads the most. So this is where we think it's that uncertainty's a way bigger driver, well, for the need of these reopeners than you know, potentially capturing those one-off big new connections, which is really important as well. But it's that big high voltage network reinforcement requirement that's been driven from a whole bunch of smaller existing customers as a one we think there's a bit of a risk at the moment of falling through the gaps.
Thanks for that, Andrew.
Scott, wish I was like Andrew.
Sorry. Thanks, Scott.
We go to Rob Tweedy next. You see, has his hand up?
Yeah, I think just after on Scott's point, and I know it's been mentioned a few times around you know, the speed of applications. So I think we did put in one some time back, which we didn't get, and it took about 9 months. And I think looking at the Unison reopener that they got some time back, I think I tried to sort of figure out exactly how long that reopener process took. I know it was for one specific project, but I think it was in quite a timely manner. And I think the other thing is with the fibre IAMS process, if we have those gates, and there's a little bit more certainty around it, it's potentially going to save us time when it comes. I know it's sort of going not off topic, but it'll help when we are actually putting in those applications for reopeners.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah.
I think just to clarify there, Rob, I don't think we formally received an application from Orion with that one. So I think we had initial discussions, and that's probably where it fell down. And obviously there's different drivers for that one compared to ultimately the only one that was successfully in the regime to date, which was Unison. But I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do as part of this workshop, is where there's probably been an absence of clarity, is to try and put some of that clarity in place. So recognise for you in that situation, it was harder, and that's hopefully as we get more applications under our belt and work through what we can put in place via the IAMS, that'll help in that area.
Thanks.
I think we might move to the next topic now.
Well, thanks very much for sharing your views on the materiality of the thresholds. And
we just had one
Andrew.
Yeah, I was just looking through Transpower's reopener, EMD reopener process, and I guess there's a question. It relates a bit around to thresholds, but it relates also to application process, where their proposals, and one of them's of $10 million, is done in a couple of pages. So in terms of overall overhead and quantum, I think that provides a useful framing reference point in addition to the fibre IAMS for how much effort is possibly required. Which comes back to Will's point. It's about how everything fits into the overall mechanism. So I understand with Transpower that they can make those applications in their mechanism, but to the extent our forecasting is potentially done on the same basis, similar basis, then I'd be interested in the Commission's view, maybe not now, but taking account or considering the succinctness that Transpower can have in its applications process, regardless of the quantum.
What do you want to read? Grant just has a couple of points to say on that, Andrew.
Yeah, as a number of you know, I work on both Transpower and on EDB matters. So I have the advantage of having been involved in the reopener processes, and from a Transpower point of view. There's some learnings from that, and I agree with Andrew that there are some good things in there that can be adopted. There's also a few little glitches in the process in terms of how the rules work. So we are contemplating how we can incorporate the best parts of those things that we're using elsewhere and have them apply to EDBs and the DPP. Something that hasn't been discussed so far, and I'd just like to introduce this into the discussion, I guess, is we contemplate that with the DPP, which is essentially a fairly low touch. You might not think of it in this way, but a fairly low touch type regime compared to the depth of a CPP or the Transpower IPP. The thing is that we're thinking about how we identify or how you identify uncertainties that would apply in the periods after a reset for a DPP. you know, we are moving into, everyone acknowledges that we're moving into an era of greater uncertainty. And so the key thing that we are focusing on is the scenarios that the scenario information that you include in your AMPs or include with your AMPs, and how those scenarios can signal to us the types of mechanisms and the types of guidance that we're able to provide to you going forward. So I'm interested. I mean, obviously, it will come down to the quality of the scenarios that you devise and how specific you can be within those scenarios about the impacts. And the other thing with those scenarios is the extent to which they bite within the regulatory period. Some of the things that some of you have talked about, and we mentioned it in the earlier slides, is the ability of the DPP to try and anticipate some of those uncertainties so that the reopeners only deal with those things, those events which arise unexpectedly within the DPP period. So I'd invite comments now on how you see those scenarios and your ability to gear up to provide that information.
Hey, Andrew.
Happy to break the silence if no one else is going to. I think it's again a good idea in theory, and some things can be scenario driven. But I'm just looking back to our submission on the DPP3, you know, determination or process, and we can't, you know, while we have a decent view of known projects, scenario analysis potentially has sort of limited use when you know, you literally, a customer can come out of the woodwork in 2 years' time that you just could not have reasonably or sensibly sort of caught in any sort of scenario analysis. Now that's because I'm thinking of a particular lens on here of customers doing you know, large upgrades to their requirements. So I'm sure there'll be some requirements that can be captured in scenario analysis, which are more, maybe it's EV growth or changes to energy efficiency and those more sort of systemic things. But yeah, I don't think scenario analysis can capture everything. And directors can't, so, you know, I agree we can provide some information in that space, Grant, but to the extent directors are signing off forecasts, we have to be confident that you know, the forecasts are efficient and prudent, so and robust, so that to the extent the base forecast, you know, just can't include some of the things that we can't see yet.
We appreciate that point, Andrew. You know, that there's probably only a limited range of scenarios that you can include information on. More questions? Rob, did we see your hand go up?
Yes, just a quick one. I think on the scenario analysis and the AMPs, the sort of feedback that I've got is we are looking at various likelihoods of sort of those scenarios occurring, and then what the impacts would be on the network. So while it is a bit of uncertainty around what will happen, we are considering that as in likelihood and then impact, just to sort of paint some sort of picture that that we have considered that in the AMPs.
That's good to hear. Thanks for that point, Rob. So I'm getting a signal here from the timekeep that we're at time? Time for one more question? Okay. Scott, feel free.
I guess probably just adding on to Andrew's is, I think there's we've got to be careful on how much weight we put on that scenario analysis, because there's just so many uncertain things that are still being decided through the emissions reduction plans, whether what happens with gas, for example, whether there'll be some sort of incentives on EVs and all that sort of stuff. So I'd definitely grain of salt on how those scenario analysis or that information's used. I'd hate to think that would have really binding drivers within our reg frameworks on something that is just so uncertain. As soon as we started talking about that, it made me really nervous around how we might use that information. All I had to say.
For that point, thanks for your feedback. Good to go? Any more?
Stepna and I would now like to talk with you about reopeners, about the reopeners that we currently use and the circumstances which are covered by them. A number of you made submissions about what's covered by the current reopeners and the need to either expand what's covered by our current reopeners or to apply new reopeners to address the higher levels of uncertainty anticipated as we transition to a low carbon emissions economy and the associated changes in demand that results. In the slides that we sent out prior to the workshop, we mapped the scenarios raised against what is covered by the reopeners that are currently used for DPPs and CPPs. In our view, most of the matters raised in your submissions are covered by the current reopeners. Could you please provide some feedback now about our initial assessment, re what's covered in the current reopeners?
So we've got the current unforeseeable and foreseeable major CapEx reopeners that address the transition to increase electrification. So it includes things like providing for system growth connection and asset relocation, except where a non-traditional OPEX solution is proposed. We've also got the current gas capacity event and risk event reopeners, which I think we also covered earlier in the workshop, which provide coverage for uncertain capacity and unforeseen asset deterioration as well. Yeah, so I think if we can start maybe with exploring electrification to start with. So can we hear from you if there is anything else that you think is related to electrification that is not already covered by our reopeners? About views for that? Scott?
Just repeating what I talked about before. So this is your uncertain demand growth from existing connections. I do see you've got incremental demand growth and appears to be covered by the foreseeable. So at the moment, as I understood it, that was restricted to where you've got one or two, or maybe one customer that's connecting, that's driving that. But if you've got, for example, a whole, just general EV uptake or the conversion from gas or that kind of incremental growth from existing connections, how that might be captured at the moment, if that's driving, for us, for example, would be big network reinforcement quicker than expected. And you've got the flexibility or the ability to purchase OPEX services, which I think is important.
Yeah, so on the flexibility point, we just move to that slide. Next one. Yeah, I think when we covered the key issues earlier, I mentioned that there was, one topic that that we're not discussing in this workshop that we're expecting written submissions on, and that is, you know, we are thinking about how our reopeners can take into account OPEX solutions. So that is part of the thinking, Scott. And with your earlier question on incremental demand growth, I think the reason that we've shown this as currently covered is that it is covered if it meets the threshold that is part of the CapEx reopener. Was your point that if it is above the cap?
Maybe
Scott?
it's my understanding, but I thought there had to be a customer supporting the application
Yep,
in
there
terms
needs
of the
to
new
be.
growth. So if you've got 10,000 customers that have just bought EVs, how do you get that customer support for the application? Are you envisaging a consultation in lieu of a customer letter supporting an application increase?
Probably something we need to think about, I think. Yeah.
Or you might have 2 or 3 developers which are driven a network reinforcement requirement in the HV, for example, or multiple connections. So it's that when you can't pin the especially with network reinforcement, when you can't pin it down to 1 or 2 customers, how do you get that triggered?
I'll just jump in on that one. We can work that one for you, Scott, but I think my reading of the IMs is there's a bit of a distinction between the different types of foreseeable growth CapEx, and a lot of it does actually require the connecting party, but not all of the clauses. So I can catch up with you offline on that one.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I think that's a really important trigger. If they already capture that, great. If they don't, I think there would be a lot of and there'll be still a need for capturing that sort of uncertain CapEx somehow.
Yeah, so a lot of the clauses at the moment have the authorised officer of the connecting party has committed to the project or program, but there is a clause in there which is just the EDB has provided sufficient evidence that the project or program for system growth CapEx is prudent. So I think that probably picks up that part of where there isn't one party, that there's multiple parties.
Cool.
So
I have a comment coming from Andrew Kerr saying, increase in capacity only covered if greater than 30 million.
You want to talk to that, Andrew?
I was just observing, just repeating the discussion earlier, if growth or increasing capacity is more than 30 million, it's not covered by the reopeners. That's all.
Sarah Carter? Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Hey, I was thinking, well, what about something less tangible, like expectation from consumers that there's a increase in security of supply, or quality standards were to improve? Something like the expectation that there'll be less outages simply because now there's a greater reliance on electricity. How would an EDB evidence that for the purpose of a reopener?
Sure. Do you mean it comes up as part of a reopener, Sarah, or?
Yeah, say
as part of a
yeah, so say that over time, an EDB was to receive increasing levels of complaints around the number of so the number of outages that they were having on the network were well within the quality standards, but there was an expectations from customers that the reliability was higher, for example. So say you had customers who now had gone completely, they completely electrified their heating and their transport, etc. And so now what they need to have is that reliance, but they're having outages, but they're not unreasonable under the quality standards. So there's no sort of push necessarily for the EDB to improve quality standards other than that their customers are demanding it. Now, you're not necessarily going to have that come from any one customer. You may not even have that come from any one group of customers. So then you've got that issue again of it's something that you believe your customers expect. It's a cost that you haven't foreseen necessarily because that expectation is formed over time. And now how are you going to evidence it? So it's back to the issue that was just raised around, well, you're not going to go out and get a whole heap of customers to sign it. And you might not even get a very good reaction to a consultation. Yeah, it comes down to if you have less, so as an increase in capacity or an increase in demand growth or unexpected growth in connections, you can evidence all of that actually quite easily because you can see it, because it's tangible. But what do you do about meeting increasing customer expectations, and how would that fall into a reopener is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't think it's currently covered, but I think we'll take your view and have a think about, that it is one limb that relates to increased electrification.
I guess, Sarah, the irrelevant factor is willingness to pay. So you're saying potentially you didn't get good engagement through consultation. I mean, if we're looking at price increases for consumer, do you want to make sure that they understand that they're going to have to pay for it? So I think there is an issue there that needs to be worked through. So yeah, we can have a chat in the context of reopeners, but I think just more broadly, it's a wider question.
We did identify some potential gaps in relation to disaster readiness and additional reporting, greater use of digitalisation and data, and cybersecurity costs. However, our initial view is that these costs are foreseeable and covered by business forecasts. And we were just wondering if we could tease out with you now what you meant by disaster readiness. It was something that was raised a number of times in the submissions that you made. And also, you may have noticed that for fibre, the catastrophic event reopener means an event or the credible threat of an event, and uses cybersecurity as an example. And so we were wondering what you meant by cybersecurity, and was it an incident, or was it a threat, or planning for a cyber incident or threat? So we've got a few minutes if any of you wanted to make any comments or to explain what you were thinking with disaster readiness and cybersecurity.
Had your hand up. Sorry, was Rob first?
Rob first? Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think just with on the cybersecurity side of things, we have got quite a big piece of work on the go, and I think with the reopener, we're sort of looking at it from the work around just securing our network, from cyber attacks, because we have had a couple of incidents. And I think just around the digitization and data, we are seeing a significant amount of investment going into it over the next couple of years. So, there's going to be quite a bit of work in that space. So just concerned that with a historical view that we may not get that in our next round of allowances. So the potential of having this, using this reopener is quite big. I think it's also for seeing the use of data from if we get access to meter data. I know that hasn't quite happened yet, but being able to manage all that information in quite a large scale. So yeah.
The current level of planning that's happening around that, are you saying that it may not be as detailed in the AMP?
It is going to be quite detailed, but it would need a more forward-looking approach to capture that in the allowances. If we were going to get that through the DPP4 allowances, otherwise a reopener would probably be required.
Yeah, I'm just aware that there's a parallel process of consultation happening on the forecasting approach. So, you know, we need to look at what comes out of that as well.
Okay.
But thanks, Rob. Richard?
Yeah, just I suppose picking up on what Rob said, like in regards to cyber security, it's definitely the risk management elements there. So these expenditures are occurring as we're managing risk of cyber going forward, which is growing. So it's not just to sort of handle one incident, it's the ongoing risk management of that risk. And it's not always practical to, if you think of the Commission's current forecasting, and recognise your comment earlier that you're looking at forecasting, but if you take that traditional approach of sort of looking historically, then that might not be a good predictor of what the spend is going forward. Also, in regards to sort of cyber security, it's not always CapEx, so it's obviously OpEx because you can buy services in regards to that. So how that plays into the thinking. And then in regards to sort of data and digitalization, that's very much an enabler of the future. And as the requirements on the LV network increases, as customers electrify more and there's more requirements for LV visibility, the extent that forecasting can anticipate that in advance, or is there still a need for flexibility around that sort of expenditure going forward as things evolve? So that would just be a general comment on those two from me.
Richard?
If there aren't any other questions, we had a question coming through the chat from Ken Brown just on the previous slide. So, so regarding the foreseeable major CapEx reopener for a small percentage of revenue, a percentage of revenue is 300,000, yet not 2 million CapEx. If say 500,000 CapEx added for timing of EV uptake, can this go ahead as a reopener?
That would be under the threshold.
The question was?
Go for it, Ken.
Yeah, so the question was that greater than 1% revenue and 2 million CapEx, are they both traps that you've got to meet? So our 1% on an annual basis, our 1% revenue is 300k per year. So if it's 2 or 3 years, it might be 600 or 900. Does it have to incur a cost greater than $2 million CapEx to be at the minimum?
I'll go back and check, but I think it's either, and it's the lesser of the two.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. So I think at a great point.
Yeah, do you want to look at this one?
Oh, we could actually, yeah, seeing as we've got time.
Some of you identified that new reopeners are needed to address higher levels of uncertainty was anticipated as we transition to the low carbon emissions economy and the associated change in demand that results. We're just wondering if you're able to expand on these comments. We haven't been able to assess whether the current reopeners cover these scenarios because we weren't quite sure what you were considering then. So if you are able to expand on those comments, that would be really helpful.
So this relates to the, there we go. Saba, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I'll just provide a little background on that. Last year, December's workshop, in response to that workshop, we submitted that for decarbonization, and to support decarbonization, we would see DER uptake, and our distribution and transmission networks need to be ready to enable that kind of DER uptake and to support DER uptake. And recently, we also saw a report coming from ENA that also talks about solar penetration, and we have seen solar penetration in other parts of the world, and it was like I would say aggressive, quite aggressive than anyone could have anticipated it. And if we can't tell that if we would have solar intake or solar uptake on specific parts of the network, what would the speed of that uptake be? Where would we see it? We don't know the scale, the speed, anything about it. But if we see that kind of thing coming forward in near future, or maybe, I don't know, medium term or longer term, we can't tell when we would see it, but definitely we are going to see it. And our systems needs to be ready to take that, like export from those solar networks. In case if we are not like ready, or our systems are not ready, it does mean that we are kind of delaying more green energy on our networks and for the consumers, cheaper energy for the consumers. In that report, like ENA report also kind of mentions that solar will make, like solar penetration or solar uptake will make power cheaper for the consumers. So if we want to enable that, like distribution networks, our networks need to be ready for that. We can't tell what the scale or what penetration level of that solar uptake would be. Where would we see it? That's what I wanted to say that. And where is that covered? Like how those expenses will be covered. Thank you.
I think the coverage at the moment is limited by the thresholds that we have. So I think with the points that you mentioned, we need to take that away to think about. So,
thank you.
Would anyone else like to offer any views on this last point on general uncertainty? Jonathan, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm just going to sort of expand on what Saba was saying. I guess the question is, reopeners, a lot of them are reactive. It is, we've seen this unexpected growth, so we need to spend some money. But what Saba sounds like she's talking about is proactive, where we say, hey, actually, we expect to see this thing in a year or two time. Can we build it now so that we're ready, rather than scrambling at the end of the day to meet customer expectations?
So I guess some of that comes into the initial DPP revenue setting and what information is available at that point in time. So that's probably the first level we've got. Obviously, reopeners are able to, within the period, they're an option for flexibility. Again, we're probably trying to understand what information is available in the abstract. It's kind of hard to exactly say without a little bit more information how it's exactly going to fit, but that's something we can put some more thought into.
Got a question from Ken.
Just following up, sorry, just following on. Yeah, just following on from that, there's a kind of a circular logic going on around here, because if there's uncertain things such as EV uptake, heat transitions, all of those things. In a sense, we don't know how much and when that's going to happen. So it kind of meets that unexpected growth kind of continuum. But because we don't actually have much evidence to actually know when it's going to happen, we just know that it could happen, but it could happen in 5 years' time, it could happen in 7 years' time. Because if you're a small EDB in a province, you don't necessarily know whether 60% or 80% of your consumers are going to take up EVs. And with that logic, you also don't have a logic to actually put it into an AMP and say, we're going to lay down and spend $1 million on an upgrade for a demand we don't know when that's going to happen, because it literally could happen in 3 years' time, it could happen in 5 years' time, it could happen in 7 years' time. So there's kind of a circular logic that sort of locks everything out of it and says it may not necessarily fit a reopener, but it also may not, you don't have enough evidence to put it into the AMP.
I think within the AMPs we'd still be interested in the scenarios. So based on what certain events could occur, what you see the impact of those events might be.
But the nature of, because you don't know when it's going to be foreseeable and you don't even really necessarily have a cost, because in a place like our network, you don't necessarily know the quantum of EV uptake.
Yep, so it might not be your favoured scenario, but I think if it's something you're thinking about, we'd still like to understand some of that thinking, and it may be that it doesn't get in via the reset process, and we can look at how that might fit with a reopener within the period.
Yep, okay. Thank you.
Richard, I think you're up next.
Yeah, so I think a good example of that where there's quite high uncertainty, and you don't know when it's going to happen, but it will happen, is that distribution companies are going to have to transition to being a DSO, and that's going to require them to be sort of the conductor of a whole variety of different devices on their networks. And if you look at other jurisdictions, regulators are already, thinking through the requirements for distributors to become DSOs, but it's very hard to sort of say when it'll occur, how much the cost will be. But the reality is that it is going to happen. And so I suppose the question is, how fearful are you of allowing some investment earlier rather than later, given that it's going to be critical to achieve net zero objectives, and having this coordination of flexibility and other services on the network. So yeah, I think that's a good example of how electrification is going to change the shape of distributors, but a lot of it, when it occurs, how much, is quite uncertain, and how you put a solid business case forward to get the right expenditures to achieve that, I think, is challenging.
Thanks, Richard. Next.
Yep, just expanding on what Ken and Richard said, it's just kind of same thing that I was also wanting to say. We can provide some scenarios where major generation is kind of looking forward to connect to a network, but for microgrids or small solar connections like 10 kilowatt or something like that, or a few 110 kilowatt connections, like we can't tell when are we going to see it. So does Commission want us to be able to be proactive and be ready for that? Or does the Commission look at this scenario as something like that when it happens, then we need to make investment and get ready? So how does Commission see it?
I guess we're talking at quite a high level here, and that's where some of the difficulty comes, because I think it's not that we think investment needs to be incremental. There's definitely flexibility within the regime to build further ahead of need, but it will depend on what sort of information is available and what the likelihood is and what the cost is that's involved. So yeah, and as a general comment, it's quite hard to give a definitive answer.
Yeah, I agree. Dane, the regime is remarkably flexible. I think it deals with a lot of the issues at the smaller scale that are being raised. It's just part of being a good quality distributor, as you have to sort of plan ahead for some of these things, and it can be factored into your forecasts. In terms of this general uncertainty, I wonder if there's a gap, and I've been struggling to. It's sort of linked to Rich's comment about the DSO concept. Is there could be changes that aren't legislated but are sort of robust or firm enough that necessitate taking some action which is significant. And again, I'm speaking in the general again. So it's probably perhaps under general uncertainty that it's just ensuring there's enough flexibility to be able to accommodate those things that happen within period that again couldn't have been reasonably forecast at the start. And I think we could quite comfortably say for our AMP that will be used for 2024, or for the for DPP4, to the extent we're forecasting what, as an example, we might be doing in the DSO space in 2028 or 2029, I'm sure we'll get it wrong, and it will be prudent to not be seeking that forecast, not seeking that expenditure to be paid by consumers. So I imagine there will be a class of things that either aren't a direct event or a direct category or purely legislatively driven, but are the sum of some of those parts. And I will rack my brains to see if there's something from, say, ECA or the EA, which is in the guidance, or code, not the code because that would pass, something which is firm enough that would necessitate this other general uncertainty provision. But I think that's the thing to turn your mind to, is what are the sorts of things that fall through the cracks of those other lenses.
That's helpful, Andrew. Also, if you can include this in your written sub, that would be appreciated. Did you want to offer a comment, Grant?
Yeah, it's Grant here.
I'll just swing this around. Give me a minute.
Yeah, something that we're working on is the wording of the change event reopener. The fibre AMs did make some tweaks to the wording of the change event reopener, and clarification to that. If Andrew, if you've got thoughts on how to, in a structured way, move that purely from legislation and regulation into that other category that you're talking about, which is credible promulgations, or whatever you want to call it. We'd be interested to hear from you, and if you can express that in the context of the change reopener, that would be really interesting from our point of view. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So one example I can think of is if there's enough, if there's a demand, one or another, for us to cover accommodate our net zero or otherwise costs in some way, that could be something that gets covered. But yeah, thanks for the invitation. Yeah, credible promulgation isn't a term I would have come up with, Grant, so thanks for seeding that as a starter for 10.
We've just had indication from the timekeeper that we're approaching time. Rob, is it possible for you to just put your question in on chat so that we've captured it?
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for all your feedback. We're now going to take a break for 10 minutes. Well, it's actually just going to be a bit under 10 minutes now. So could we be back at 11:15, please?
Thanks, everyone.
There we go. Yeah.
Welcome back. For the next few minutes, we would like to talk with you about other in-period adjustment mechanisms. Reopeners, as some of you have raised, apply to all regulated providers in the same sector in the same way. Given the likelihood that we may have more requests to reopen the price quality path in the future, we're considering whether there may be or there should be varying levels of scrutiny on our part, depending on the materiality of the impact of the reopener. Tied to this point is evaluating whether there are other mechanisms requiring potentially less scrutiny that could be part of the suite of options. These include contingent projects or contingent allowances, where projects are identified and listed in advance and are well supported by information and asset management plans. Whether there could be a different approach for smaller suppliers, such as use it or lose it allowances, and whether wash-up mechanisms could apply to more scenarios. Use it or lose it allowances are provided where the need for funding has been identified at the time of setting the DPP, but the timing or the exact amount of expenditure is uncertain. Unspent allowances must be returned. So we'd like to now discuss with you whether you consider that there may be value in the Commission applying a range of mechanisms. For example, looking at, say, reopeners used for larger suppliers as part of the DPP, and say use it or lose it allowances for smaller suppliers. And also whether you think there are circumstances, and some of you have raised this, where you think you may want to have a contingent project listed in a DPP, and why the current reopeners that we have aren't suitable for that. So we'd just like to open it up for comment. Thanks.
Jonathan. You're on mute.
Oh, hello. Yeah, I guess on those 2 points, I guess on the first point around having a range of mechanisms, I think that could be particularly helpful, particularly for I'll say small EDBs, where we don't always have the kind of resource that's needed to go for a full-blown I'll say full-blown reopener. Amongst all the other, I'll say all the other priorities, we're also, also juggling with the same staff. And in terms of the sort of contingent project, I think that's a great idea, because one of the problems with reopeners is, I think as people have mentioned earlier, just how slow they can be. Electrification, we expect it to accelerate. So having the ability to say, we know we're going to need to, build this thing, but we don't know when it's going to be triggered by an increase in solar. So being able to actually effectively have it pre-approved so that you can start work when the trigger happens, rather than having the trigger and then having to go through the process. I think both of those will really help sort of speed up our ability to respond to consumer need.
If I could just clarify one point there that you made, Jonathan. Yes, the contingent projects will be listed in advance. However, that just to exercise some caution over the point of pre-approval, because it kind of depends on the quality of information that we get at the point of listing. Yeah.
Yeah, that there's ability to navigate that information before the event rather than after.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Who else have we got? Andrew Kerr.
Kia ora. I've turned my camera on this time. I think one area where it could be useful, and I don't think it relates to the size of the distributor, I think we should all provide a great level of service no matter how big or small we are, is that some projects evolve in their design and cost through time, and the ability to be able to meaningfully adapt to that would be helpful. And it sort of links to the reprioritisation discussion earlier, that reprioritising is not necessarily optimal. It's just a mechanism, whereas this provides an alternative mechanism where you've already planned for the project. It's just that at the time of doing the planning, you may not have done the geotech or have done the detailed design work. That just naturally happens as a project evolves. And what I have in mind is exactly as you described earlier. I think the sort of board paper type, something akin to a board paper should be the type of thing that if directors are signing it off, that should be quite easily amenable for the commission as well. So yeah, that's the sort of circumstance I can imagine where it's a firming up of cost, and it also sets an incentive or removes any incentive to be concerned about trying to factor in unnecessary risk into those costs. So there's probably a link here into IRIS incentives and other things as well to bear in mind. That's it for me.
Yeah, just adding to the one of the challenges that we've been thinking about, and I know this is outside of the scope today, but between regulatory periods, how do you, so if you've got a long project, say it's 2 or 3 years to implement and it's not going to be commissioned till the next regulatory period, how do you deal with those longer lead times and having some, I guess, confidence for the board to invest earlier? So this idea of a pre-approval, I think is great, and it could be a mechanism to allow the bridging between regulatory periods. So you might have something approved in one regulatory period, have confidence enough to put it into, kind of have a pre-approved or pre-tick for the next regulatory period, and actually, have a way to kind of deal with that longer project period that might work between 2 regulatory periods. I'm not sure if I explained myself particularly well then, but hopefully.
Yeah, Grant just wants to pitch in here.
Yeah, just a brief comment there. I mean, we picked that up, I think it was from your submission, actually. Yeah, that point of the multi-period investment, and what we're kind of exploring is, and I'm not suggesting that we would have anything quite as detailed as the CapEx IM for Transpower, but that does give you essentially forward approval for projects that extend beyond the current regulatory period. So we're just looking at the features of the CapEx IM that could be pulled across and adopted in a very kind of light kind of way, that might, we think that might be the solution to the point that you're raising. So that's where we're exploring at the moment. Yeah.
No, that sounds great. I mean, that's one we're battling with a real in-train example right now, and we're just trying to think of different ways of fitting it in with the customer, and there's not an easy answer. For something like that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to overpromise on that one, but I can tell you.
I've just written it down. It's sold.
Yeah, well, we are exploring it. Yeah.
Excellent.
Another question from Summer. Go ahead.
My comment is on use it or lose it allowances. Being a smaller EDB, we may not be leading the space in terms of innovation and technological advances, but we can be quick followers if we had like space or like money to spend. If there was a situation where we are given, like, let's say 1% of our total revenue as an innovation allowance on the basis of use it or lose it, and if we see an opportunity where an EDB, like a larger EDB, has like kind of a successful implementation of a new project, and we want to follow the footsteps, if we had like that kind of allowance available to us, we would definitely be like quick to follow otherwise, like we again have to go through with all the reopener process and like a long process to adopt to that technological change. But in terms of innovation, if we had similar like allowance, use it or lose it kind of allowance available, roughly, let's just making up a number, like maybe 1% of our total revenue for 5 years or net revenue for 5 years. And we know that we have that kind of ability to use that money if something comes up. So we'll be quite quick in adapting to the change. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Is there anything else from a smaller supplier perspective that you others want to offer a view on? We're running slightly ahead of time. So are there any other views or questions on these other mechanisms? Grant's just thought of something.
Just want to make a little bit of a clarification here is during the break, we were talking about what a contingent project reopener constituted. And traditionally, I think people have viewed that as being a CapEx-based thing. But I just want to make it clear that we're taking a broad view of what a contingent project reopener might include. Certainly, it will be in our thinking on the OPEX, the OPEX substitutability, for example, and also taking into account impacts on quality standards. And something we haven't mentioned much, if at all, today is bringing in the impacts on incentive measures as well. When we're thinking about those sorts of things and reopeners more generally, we're thinking of those four things as a potential suite of things that we might use to address the reopener event. And in particular, just pointing out, as I say, the contingent project reopeners, we consider that as a broad package type approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. So if there are no further questions on this topic, we might just leave it there. Just remembering that you've got the option, if you think of points later to include in your written feedback to us as well. Thanks for your views on this. Next topic is CPPs. So Grant and I are back to talk to you about this. I'll share where our current thinking is at relative to CPPs before we get into a bit of a discussion. Since CPPs are designed to better meet the particular circumstances of a supplier, there is a need for greater scrutiny. And this is why our current thinking is that the information to be provided as part of a CPP proposal, as it currently is in the INs, it must be sufficient to support the scrutiny that is required. And this is the reason why our current thinking is that the full set of information requirements should apply to all CPPs. We did hear from a number of you about these information requirements being onerous, and we'll come to that shortly. Just want to make the point that we actually have got some flexibility here. So we can adjust the depth of our scrutiny of CPPs in line with the proportionate scrutiny principle. And you would have heard Grant mention this earlier in the piece. So there is a modification or exemption clause from the CPP requirements that is currently in our IMs that we can call on as long as this doesn't negatively impact our ability to evaluate a CPP. And as long as it doesn't negatively impact interested persons to consider and provide views on the CPP proposal. So given that there is some flexibility here through the 2 points that I mentioned, and also with the discussion that you would have heard earlier on our current thinking on reopeners. Our conclusion is that there doesn't seem to be a strong case for a single issue CPP. So when we come to questions later, we'd like to hear from you if you have different views and why.
I'd just like to repeat that before we get into the questions, just like to repeat that we are thinking about using that modifications and exemptions provision in respect of the reopeners as well. So there was some concerns earlier on about, for example, $30 million cap on the reopeners. And the question was essentially seemed to be if there was a kind of a de minimis overrun on in terms of that cap, what would the situation be? I think if we were to have that kind of mods and exemptions type provision, then that could be dealt with. Those kinds of situations could be dealt with without necessarily prompting a CPP application in all of those situations. So it'd be on a case-by-case basis and on by application. But we're interested in, and this is in the questions, is what your view is on the current modification exemption provision in the CPP provisions, because we're not seeing that kind of discussion happening, and we're just trying to understand whether the circumstances haven't arisen where you think that might apply, or whether there's some aversion to the way it's drafted, or that kind of thing. I was just wondering if we could get some comments on that, because if we're thinking through of using it for the reopeners, we want to be confident that people are going to consider using it. Thank you.
Got a question from Andrew.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, hi. Grant, might just help. So I can think of some scenarios which could fall into the gap between not being a reopener and being a single issue. I think more akin to a single issue CPP. And an example could be where you've done new analysis or modelling of, say, your renewal program of a particular class of assets or something like that, where you go, yeah, that's, you know, significant, more than 30 million. So that's a kind of meaty issue, but everything else is kind of much the same. So I just wondered, so that's a little bit of context. Could you just then, might be helpful for possibly me, but everyone else, just go through how the modification exemption you envisage that would work? It could work to address that type of scenario.
Well, I can talk about the sorts of things that we might consider, that, you know, that we might think about. Obviously, you know, the obvious thing would be, what are the knock-on effects of a rescoped renewal program? You know, what are the impacts on the cost structure of the organisation more generally as a result of that, outside of the project itself? You know, if you were to kind of paint a picture that had broad-ranging changes across the organisation in terms of a general overhead and other things, then you're talking about a more full scope CPP rather than a single issue kind of situation.
Agree, but imagine it's not.
Yeah, so it is going to be a horses for courses kind of thing in terms of application of that mods and exemption provision. We're not looking at this stage of codifying a single purpose CPP. So we are interested in your view on whether the mods and exemption provision is sufficient for the types of situations that you're contemplating. Yeah.
Thanks.
I am aware, though, you know, obviously from, again, referring to my Transpower experience, we do have some similar things in there in terms of how renewals are treated, I'd call it a little bit more generously in terms of thresholds and that sort of thing, compared to growth type assets. So I'd be interested in receiving comments from you on this, on how you might distinguish a very narrow renewal project from a broader ranging growth type project or combination of growth projects.
Thanks. Yeah, links into the forecasting approach as well. So yeah, it's a whole system, right? But
yeah,
I think it's really helpful to know that your intent is that the mods and exemptions is the mechanism you'd like to try and have applied. So that's great. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes, Scott.
Just I guess digging into that a little bit further. So the mods and exemptions, do you envisage that being a relatively process orientated, so a process that you can rely on in terms of making an application, with the expectation of having something like a single issue CPP, or would be part of the judgment of the CPP application? I guess where I'm going to is I guess from a network making an application, how reliant, I guess once you've made that application, that ship's kind of sailed. But how certain or reliant could you be on the process of ending up with a single issue CPP if that's where you wanted to go? Again, I don't think I've worded it very very well, but I guess with the CPP, it's really around the certainty of the outcome, as when you're making it, which I think is important. But how do you envisage that working with the mod, and I've forgotten the name of it, this mechanism?
Well, I mean, we're still sort of going through the thinking processes on this at the moment, and that's why we're sort of testing this with you guys now, is whether you do think something like that could work, because we can then, as you say, work our way through what the process requirements look like, and to give guidance and more certainty about how you get an outcome by going through the process. I think that's something that's, I mean, at the moment, I could classify this as, the IMs tell you the what about the modification exemption, but they don't tell you the how. And it's a little bit like the reopener processes more generally, is that we need to put a bit more of the how into the IMs to kind of give you that certainty about how you would get to an outcome.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, that would be super important. You wouldn't want to, make an application with the expectation of it being a ring fence program, then suddenly you're up for a full CPP and all the costs cost and time along with that as well. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think just going back to the points that Andrew raised about, I think it'll be important in terms of us setting up process requirements, and a little bit like what James and I talked about earlier on for the reopeners generally, is to have that step-by-step thing set out in the IMs, in the CPP IMs, alongside the mods and exemption provision that tells you the steps that you need to go through and the particular information that you need to provide that demonstrates that you're not actually in that broad-ranging CPP territory, that you've got a narrow case there that can be dealt with just purely on its own merits, rather than opening the books to everything, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Got a question from Lynn Taylor.
Lynn.
Grant. Yeah, good discussion. I think it's a useful direction to start thinking about modifications and exemptions in the context of DPP reopeners. I think when we think about how they've been applied in the CPP context to date, I think my observation is it's been quite a narrow view on modifications and exemptions to CPPs, and also the alternative methodologies with equivalent effect, the MWEs, which were introduced into the IM review last time round. And that's partly because of the criteria that's around those in the IMs that needs to be met. But just thinking about the CPP process in terms of those modifications or exemptions, I mean, currently the process for applying for a CPP is that the application must be compliant with the IMs. It's lodged with the Commission, and then the Commission takes a little bit of time assessing the compliance of the application before it accepts the application. And so I just wonder if that's a process that could be considered when we're thinking about modifications and exemptions more broadly. And secondly, just picking up on Scott's comment about the complexity of a CPP. Just thinking about the Wellington Electricity CPP application. So that was quite an interesting example of what was effectively a single issue CPP, I think. And I think one of the things to consider about that application and potential use for single issue CPPs is that that program of work that was signed off under that CPP crossed over DPP periods. So it was a program of work that started within one DPP and then moved into the next DPP period. And I think potentially that could be a reason why a single issue CPP may be appropriate. If we're wanting to try and make CPPs more accessible to a wider range of EDBs or regulated businesses, because currently, you know, there are some real barriers in terms of resource cost commitment and effort to going into a full CPP process. I just wonder if a single issue CPP is something that could sit alongside more forward-looking DPP expenditure allowances and more expensive DPP reopeners as a useful sort of suite of mechanisms to help meet regulatory objectives.
Yeah, I guess I like the sound of what you're saying there, Lynn, but one of the things we've got to do in terms of the IM review is actually work out where we get our bang for our buck. And I guess, you know, we really need to hear some fairly firm demand for a single issue CPP before we start building one. It's a little bit like some of the stuff that the industry does in terms of building to demand. You know, we've got a number of things that we're working on, and it's before we spend the time to kind of do the analysis, finalize the analysis, and do the drafting of something like a single purpose CPP provision. We really do want to kind of hear that there is demand out there for it, or potential future demand out there for it. And we're not, I guess as Sutton said, we're not seeing that at the moment.
So far.
Yeah, at the moment. And so I guess we'd like to kind of receive those signals before we press ahead with that. And I guess Scott's got his hand up. Maybe he's the one that's going to give us the signal.
I guess I was going to be a bit more woolly than that, which is, yeah, probably not super useful. But I guess it depends on what the final structure is, a potential reopeners or contingent event, or, you know, what the tools are for working over the bridging the regulatory period. So if that covers all of the different future investment uncertainty investments that we need, then yeah, maybe. But if it doesn't, I guess where a single issue and our experience with it, single issue CPP, it's a great mechanism for capturing the combination of costs, whether it's CapEx, your related OpEx, and overhead, increment you might need. It is a really useful way of ring fencing that, and as Lynn talks about, it's again bridging the regulatory periods as well. It's a really cool tool for fitting fitting it into what potentially the customers want or what the network needs. So I guess hard decision until you've made your final decisions around what those other mechanisms might be. At the moment, it seems like a good fit for a lot of that stuff, but again, you might be right. If there's a lot of flexibility in the others, maybe it's all covered. It's tricky to make that call now. We can come up with a bunch of examples, but it depends on what it fits.
I mean, I would appreciate you putting pen to paper on that thought, actually. And there will be other opportunities, obviously, particularly at the time we put out our draft decisions in the first half of next year. And that's when you'll be able to see the complete picture that we've kind of come up with those other mechanisms. And if you feel at that point that those other mechanisms do fall short for you against the criteria that you've just outlined, then obviously there's an opportunity then to pull that back into the ring as well. Yeah.
It would be useful for us to hear some examples of the sources of future single issue CPPs, because then we can use that to determine, whether it's adequately covered by DPPs or whether it needs a small tweak.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that mapping analysis like the earlier slides. We'll map our existing provisions against the kind of circumstances that you outlined to us. The possible circumstances that you outlined to us, and if we do find, as you say, that the suite of other mechanisms don't adequately or well cover the situations you're describing, then we will advance something like a single purpose CPP.
Yeah, and it may, to Lynn's point, it may need a suite of things. I mean, the reopeners we've talked about today have got barriers, whether it's a reg period itself or whether it's a combination of costs that might come up, uncertainty. I mean, for us, the resilience wouldn't have, that earthquake resilience program wouldn't have fitted a reopener as they're being discussed at the moment, just because of the types of costs and the combination of costs and the timing. In fact, there's probably one we haven't talked about yet, is resilience and how that might drive future programs. But it sounds good.
Thank you. Alec?
Yeah, I guess my comment and question is a little bit more philosophical and probably goes back to a more first principles approach. Is, CPPs themselves are expensive and time consuming, and I have a concern that CPPs might be out of the reach of smaller price quality regulated businesses for those reasons. And we talk about almost from the point of encouraging single issue CPPs, which I think will still be relatively expensive and time consuming, and potentially even reopeners by the time you go through evidencing them and perhaps, verifying them, could be expensive as well. Now, the DPP is a relatively low cost mechanism. So I guess my question is, given those alternatives, is the Commission confident that it has correctly calibrated what relatively low cost means in terms of the DPP setting, and whether by taking a slightly more comprehensive approach that would consider some individual circumstances of each EDB through the DPP setting mechanism, whether those additional costs could be avoided, because those costs not only affect EDBs, but they also affect the operations of the Commission as well. I'm pretty sure you guys don't want to be prioritising 4 or 5 single issue CPPs and a whole bunch of reopeners.
No, that's obviously, I mean, this is part of the ongoing discussion that comes from the November the 7th workshop, and we'll go into the thinking around what the DPP4 setting looks like, and we haven't landed that yet, and we've invited comments on that. So
I think
it's all linked up. Dane, yeah.
Probably a couple of things I can add there. Like, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with relative. We definitely don't see it as a low cost instrument just of itself. It's relative to potentially what the alternatives are. And I think we see it as a flexible tool. So definitely in terms of considering what sort of more bespoke or tailoring elements could be added to it, I think that's definitely on the table. So I think you've raised a really good point around the cost of CPPs and the burden of reopeners. And that's something that I was going to highlight in my kind of closing remarks, is that I think, we really do need to look across the whole package and see how it fits together. And today we've had some really good conversation around some of the detail of the reopeners, but we'll need to look and stand back from it and see where some of the burden lies. And it could well be that the DPP does a lot of the heavy lifting and the reopeners are in support.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And there is a nexus here between expenditure setting mechanisms and reopeners. In my view, CPPs are not a mechanism for dealing with forecast error or forecast inadequacy. They really need to be dealing with changed circumstances for the EDB, I think. Yeah. The reopener, I think, should be an adjustment mechanism, but there will be a degree to which, I think it should apply as well. So again, yeah, I accept the point that it's very difficult to consider each of these things in isolation, because that they are intertwined. The forecasting approach and the kind of in-period adjustment mechanisms.
Yeah, I guess that's why we started off the discussion earlier on today with the continuum diagram, and I think you can be sure that we'll keep coming back to that one as we go through our future analysis and draft decisions, that we'll keep coming back to that, because we see it as a system, and that each of the devices within the system have their purpose and they all link up. And what we're doing is, someone here coined the term, try and make them hum. And that's what we're trying to do this time around with both the IM review and the DPP4 setting. Yeah.
We just had a comment coming through the chat from Jonathan Snape, just agreeing with Alex's comment that as a small EDB, they consider current reopeners and CPP to be too expensive and time consuming for all but the most important scenarios. So thank you for that input, Jonathan.
Yeah, again, I'll repeat what we said earlier, is that for smaller EDBs and for situations that essentially miss the cut on reopeners because of the thresholds, we are contemplating all those other mechanisms, and particularly with DPP4, we're thinking about the contingent project type provisions as well. You'll appreciate, given our experience with the listed project mechanism with Transpower, that the listed project mechanism the bones of it sit within the IMs, but the operational aspects of it sit within the price quality part determination. So that would be the same sort of approach that we'd be looking for here, would be possibly to implement a kind of broad allowance for those sorts of mechanisms within the IMs, but the detail would be set out in the DPP4 determination.
I think we've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah. I just wonder whether anyone's got any, just going off topic a little bit here, whether anyone's got any general comments about what we've talked about today before we hand over to Dane to close the session.
Jonathan's.
Yeah, Jonathan, you were up first.
Sorry, just a I guess just a quick general comment around all of these concepts of reopeners. I think an assumption that we're making is the reopeners are generally something that needs to happen. It's something that we've decided needs to happen. So the concept of having to reprioritize is really a last resort, because it means that consumers are missing out on planned work to hit this, this unforecast or unexpected thing. So we can't think of reopeners necessarily as just a nice to have.
Thanks for that view, Jonathan.
Andrew?
Thanks. I think it's just that reminder to weave in the IRIS impact or incentive impacts of dealing with this uncertainty, and linking into that is the revenue or MAR recovery impacts that I know others have raised. But yes, let's not lose sight of we can deal with the event, but we need to make it work in totality. Thanks.
Yeah. I sit just about next to Ben Harris, who's dealing with the IRIS in terms of the IM review, and so you can be assured that that we're pretty linked up on this. That any conclusions we come to, or or vice versa, that he comes to from an IRIS point of view, that will be linked up, and that will also be linked up in terms of how that works with DPP4 settings as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and as an example in the discussion of the various mappings, efficiency didn't really come up as a sort of topic that was driving some of these events in general. So, yeah, I think some good things to consider there.
Yeah. I guess we have by dividing the IM review up into sort of functional areas, we have sort of put an onus on ourselves to make sure that we remain linked up. And yeah, that was a little bit of an oversight, but it's certainly on our mind, in terms of how this all links up from an incentive point of view. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So there's nothing further. We might pass on to Dane to close the session up, but I just wanted to say a huge thanks for your investment of time. First of all, 3 hours is a huge chunk, and for all the discussion and views that you've shared today. So to Dane.
Well, thanks, Sumner. I'll keep the close relatively brief because there's something to say. It's been a large chunk of your time, and I think we've started to touch on some of those kind of key elements and that discussion that Grant kind of facilitated just before. And I think that really is around, we've had some really helpful discussions today around the scenarios, and it's really helpful to hear from the businesses in particular around kind of what they're seeing and how it'll fit. with the reopeners, and also questions around that efficiency, pace and burden both on industry and us as we look to use reopeners as a tool. But I think there'll be further opportunities for discussion, and particularly as we move through the reset process, which we've deliberately chosen to kick off early this time, much further in advance of previous resets, recognising that it really does need to be a conversation that we're having alongside these in the IM review. And within the IM review, there's other areas like incentives that are very much relevant to this conversation. So in terms of following up today, we're very keen to hear from you around any sort of follow-up remarks that you might have, any further thoughts, and I think to continue to delve into those scenarios that you face will be particularly helpful for us to size that fit. And we'll be in touch in the new year for more steps around the DPP reset process. And even though the IM review concludes at the end of next year and we're working towards draft decisions in the middle of next year as well, I think as part of the DPP reset process, there potentially could be the opportunity to kind of refine some of those IM settings a little bit further around the margins as we kind of move towards the final revenue setting. So up on screen now are just really the deadlines around the processes that we've got live, so when we can expect to hear from you. Obviously do get in touch if you've got any concerns about those, but we very much look forward to those submissions. So I'll just move on to closing us now with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki uru tapanui, kia watia, kia mama, te nāko. Te tanana te wairoa I te ara, takata. Koe ara I rongo, whakairea ake ki runga. Kia tina, tina. Uye, takie. Thank you very much, everybody.